Today's daf is Menachos daf Tzadik Dalid, and we have 4 lines from the bottom of daf Tzadik Gimel Amid Beis. So the topic of the last 2 dafin was the mitzvah of smicha. Every time a person brought a carbon, the Baal HaKarban had an obligation to do smicha. The Mishnah spoke a little bit about what smicha was. Number 1, it was done on the head of the animal. Number 2, it was done bebeis yodayim. The third halacha, and that's what we're up to, is b'makom shesoimchin sheichten. Smicha was done in the same place that shchita was done. The takef l'smicha shchita, and smicha was done immediately prior to when shchita was done. Says the Gemara, Maika Amar. A little confusing, that line. So the Gemara says Hachi Kamar. The Mishnah is not really saying 2 things, it's saying 1 thing. Smicha had to be done in the same place that the shchita was done, and the reason is shetekev l'smicha shchita, because shchita had to be done immediately after the smicha was done, and as a result, if it has to be done takev, then inevitably it was going to have to be done at the same time. As a matter of fact, the Gemara says in Masechtas Zvachim, Daf Lamed Gimel, that there was one smicha that wasn't done takev l'shchita, and that is the Mitzayr, when he brought his karbanos. So he had to do smicha. The Mitzayr, because he was tummy, wasn't allowed to enter the Azara. He had to stand at Shar Niknar. Being that he had to stand in Shar Niknar, the shchita of the Asha Mitzayr, which is the carbon that the Mitzayr, the shchita one, was Kachi Gedashtim, and it had to be B'tzafin, no less, not only in the Azara. So inevitably, it wasn't going to be takef, because the smicha was being done outside the Azara by Shar Niknar, and the shchita was going to be done in Tzafin, but that was the exception to the rule. The rule is takef l'smicha shchita, and as a result, b'makim shesoimchin sheichten. We'll speak out some rate on this in a few minutes. Up the Mishnah, chaymer b'smicha mi betnufa u mi betnufa mi b'smicha. So smicha was one of the shiyorei mitzvah that many karbanos had. Tenufa was another one of the shiorei mitzvah that some karbanos had. It says the Mishnah, there's a chumrah that smicha has over tenufa, and there's a chumrah that tenufa has over smicha. What's the chumrah that smicha has over tenufa? She'echad meinech l'chol hachaver, ve'nechad soim l'chol hachaver. If shutfin together are bringing a carbon, so not all the shutfin have to do tenufa. One of the shutfin could do tenufa on behalf of his partners. But when it comes to smicha, we saw the limud earlier this morning. There's a halacha we learned from Karbanai that every single partner in this carbon had to do his own smicha. So that's a chumrah that smicha has over tenufa, in that all the shutfin have to contribute to the smicha, but not all the shutfin had to contribute to the tenufa. Tenufa has a chumrah that smicha doesn't have. Sha tenufa nayhages bekarbanis hayachid uber karbanis tzibor. Tenufa is noyeg by karbanis yachin and karbanis tzibor. There's tenufa while the animal's alive, but there's also tenufa after the animal was already shachat. That's a chumrah that tenufa has over smicha, because smicha was only done while the animal was still alive. You never find smicha after shchita. Ubedavar sheyesh by ruach chayim, ubedavar she'ein by ruach chayim. You find tenufa bedavar she'ein by ruach chayim as well. Not only by animals, but Rashi says lechem, menachos also have tenufa, as opposed to smicha. Mashen came to smicha. You're never going to find smicha by a davar she'em by ruach chayim. You're also never going to find smicha by shchutin. The first thing the Mishnah said, that tenufa's nayheges bekarbanis hayachid uberkarbanis tzibur, that you do have by smicha. That was the previous Mishnah. The Mishnah said that there were 2 karbanis tzibur that had a mitzvah of smicha. Either way, Zach the Gemara Tanu Rabban on karbanai, it says the word karbani 3 times regarding the mitzvah of smicha, and one of the karbanis teach me the rabbis kol bali carbon l'smicha, that if many partners together bring a carbon, all the partners have to do their own smicha. You can't say that let one do the smicha and he'll be mitzvah the other one. Says the Gemara sheyachol, that in theory you could have argued v'haloi dinu umat tenufa shenisrabsa b'shchutin nismata b'chayvrim madach tenufa that has a chumrah that you find tenufa even after the animal already had shchita. Still, the halacha is that you don't need all the partners to do tenufa. Smicha shaloinis rapsa b'shchutim. Smicha, where you find that you don't do smicha after the animal's already shachat. Enoi din shetismait b'chayvrin. Certainly, you should have this halacha that one person should be able to do smicha for all the partners. Talmud, for that reason we need a pasuk karbanai. L'rabbis kol bali karbon l'smicha, to teach me that even though in Svar you could have argued kal v'chaymer mitnufa, that one person should be able to do smicha and be mitzi everybody else, just like one person to do tenufa and be mitzi everybody else. Karbanai teaches me not that way. Kol bali karbon have to do smicha. Says the Gemara, but this rabbi tenufa b'chayvrim mikal v'chaymer. Why don't we flip it, and why don't we say that if many partners are bringing a carbon, all of them should have to do tenufa, and you shouldn't allow one to be mitzi rights of the others. How would I know that? Which you don't have the halacha that the smicha b'shchutin. Still, the halacha is that all the partners have to do their own smicha. Tnufa shenisrabsa b'shchutin. Tnufa that you find a riboy. We were marba tnufas because there's a mitzvah of tnufa even b'shchutin. Eno din shet nisrabsa b'chayvim. Shouldn't there certainly be a halacha that more? You see, there's more tnufas b'shchutin, so maybe there should be more tnufas that all the partners should have to do their own tnufa. But the Gemara says that although it's true, I hear, and we don't have any pasuk to teach us to the contrary, but at the end of the day, it can't be that way. Mishum de lo yefsha, because really it's not possible. You want that if many partners, 5 people together, they chipped in, they're bringing a carbon. So there's a concept of carbon shel shutfin. Carbon shel shutfin is not a carbon sibur, it's a carbon yachid. There just happen to be yichidim, many partners that together own this carbon. Says the Gemara, even though it's far, you could say that maybe all of them should do the tenufa, but practically speaking, from a technical standpoint, it's not going to work out. Why? Linfu kulu b'hadei should all do the tenufa at the same time. Kavi chatzitza. You're going to end up with a chatzitza. Leinef v'lahader v'leinef. Should one person do tenufa, put it down, the next partner does tenufa, puts it down, the third partner does tenufa, puts it down. Tenufa, amrachman v'lei tenufas. The Torah says one tenufa, not many tenufas. And as a result, it's not something that's going to be possible. Incidentally, you see from this Gemara that there's an issue. You're not allowed to have a chatzitza when you do tenufa. So if you remember, on Daf Samech Aleph, Rashi and Tosfos argue exactly how tenufa went down, because we know that tenufa was done by the bailin and by the kohen. The kohen and the bailin had to do tenufa together. So Rashi learned that the way it happened was the bailin would put his hands on the carbon, and the kohen would put his hands underneath the hand of the bailin. Tosfos asked the kasha, there's a chatzitza, because the hand of the bailin is being chaytzitz between the hand of the kohen and the hand of the carbon. And says Tosfos, don't tell me there's no problem with chatzitza when it comes to tenufa, because it's a mefurish Gemara. Likaman, beperik shtei midos, daf Tzadik Gimel, it's really Daf Tzadik Daled, the Gemara we just learned, where the Gemara says mefurish that there is a problem of chatzitza. That's for that reason you can't have many partners all doing tenufa, because to do it one after another is not an option. You can only have one tenufa, they can't all do the tenufa together. But the bottom line is, Tosfos said, you see chatzitza is a problem. So chatzitza is a problem. Has every tenufa makes sense? Look where every tenufa there's a chatzitza problem. So Tosfos said that maybe Pshat's not like Rashi. Maybe the way the tenufa was done between the kohen and the bailam wasn't that the kohen put his hand underneath the bailam's hand, but rather the bailam would hold it on the sides and the kohen would hold it on the bottom, or vice versa. They weren't all holding it in the same exact place. But then Tosfos famously says in the Yerushalmi it's not mashma that way, because the Yerushalmi discusses tenufa by the minchas kanois. Ordinarily a woman didn't do tenufa, but there was one exception to the rule. The minchas kanois, the minchas saita. So the halacha is the woman who's the balas hakarbon, she had a mitzvah to do tenufa, and the Yerushalmi says, how do you do tenufa? Isn't it a davar mechur? The kohen's going to be holding the hand of the woman as they do tenufa. Aren't you running into a negiya issue? And Yerushalmi says 3 teruts, and we spoke about this. But says Tosfos, if they're not holding hands, if it's not being done in this chatzitza way, then l'chura, what's the issue? Elamai, it's very much mashma like Rashi. From the Gemara you see there is a chatzitza problem, so Tosfos says maybe it's not a problem, because maybe the ikr tenufa was supposed to be done with the bailam. Even though the Torah teaches us, it's learned from Sukkim, that the kohen had to be involved in the chatzitza as well. It could be the ikr was with the bailam, so it doesn't bother me. But here, when they're all bailam, if there's going to be a chatzitza from one to the other, over here it will be an issue. I'll just tell you a davar chadash that I saw on Shabbos. The Minchas Chinuch says a gevaldige chiddush. He says, what would be if the bailam himself is a kohen? Let's say the bailam is a kohen. So Minchas Chinuch says it's pashut to him that the bailam would be able to do the tenufa and wear both hats. He would be the bailam and the kohen. You wouldn't need 2 people doing the tenufa. So ordinarily, when the bailam is a Yisrael, he's a zar, so there you need a kohen, because there's a halacha that you need a kohen to contribute to the tenufa. But if the bailam himself is the kohen, in mitzvah kuf mem vav, Minchas Chinuch argues it's a davar pasha to him that you wouldn't need both of them to do tenufa. Either way, so the Mishnah had said that tenufa has a chumrah over smicha, because tenufa you have b'shchutin. There is an idea sometimes that there was a mitzvah tenufa even after the animal was already shachat, as opposed to smicha. You never find smicha b'shchutin. Break the Gemara. Is that true? Smicha b'shchutin less of. At the time we learned in the Mishnah, Bisman Kohen Gadol writes a lahakter. Kohen Gadol wanted to be makded emurim. Now we know the Kohen Gadol was makriv chelik berosh and he was noitel chelik berosh. He had veto power. So any day the Kohen Gadol decided, I want to do this avodah, he had a right to do the avodah. So says the Mishnah, in the event tent that the Kohen Gadol chose to do the avodah. This is a Mishnah Mesechtes Tamid. So he would walk up the ramp, and Vaskan B'Yamino, the Skan Kohen Gadol was to his right. When he got to the midway point of the ramp, the Skan wouldn't just stand to his right, but he would actually hold him, and he would walk him up. This is covered for the Kohen Gadol. And the Kohanim that won the Geirel, whose job it was to be involved with the Haktarah, the first Kohen would come, and he would hand the Kohen Gadol the Reish and the Rekel, the head and the foot of the animal. This is the punchline. The Kohen Gadol would do smicha on these body parts of the animal, v'zarkan, and then he would throw it. Haktarah was done bezrika. Right. The hekish of basar v'hadam, just like the dam required zrika, the Haktarah required zrika as well. So he would take the Reish and the Regel with the Kohen Gadol. He would do smicha, and then he would throw it onto the mizbech. The next Kohen would come, and he would pass l'rishayin, shtei yodayim, the two hands of the animal. Nois noi l'kohen, the Rishon would give it to the Kohen Gadol. Soymech aleim, he would do smicha on it. V'zarka. Nishmat hasheni, the second Kohen would go away. V'halach v'kachayim ma'ishitin l'shar kol evar. So there were many Kohanim that were involved, and the way it worked was one Kohen would pass it over to the next Kohen, who would give it over to the Kohen Gadol. But it was all the same process. With all the Ivarim, Soymech Aleim, the Kohen Gadol would constantly do smicha before the Haktarah, V'zarka. This man who writes, and if he wanted, who Soymech V'achem Zarkin? He didn't even have to do the Rikah Vidal. It was too heavy. He didn't want to do it. So you can be Mechabit, somebody else do it. But the bottom line is it's a Mefurish Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Mesechtes Tamid. You see that the Kohen Gadol used to do smicha on the body parts of the animal before he did the Haktarah. So you see clearly that there's smicha, even the Shchutin. Abai said, it wasn't a real mitzvah smicha. The smicha that we're talking about is the smicha that the Torah says over and over and over again. So these are real mitzvah smichas deiraisa, and we are comparing and contrasting smicha to tenufa, which also is mitzvah deiraisa. The smicha that the Mishnah Mesechtes Tamid is referring to wasn't a mitzvah deiraisa. It was just something that was done l'chvaydoi shel Kohen Gadol. What's l'chvaydoi shel Kohen Gadol? So the last Rashi Ksav Yad in Mesechtes Menachos says shetei toiras haktarasai mu'ula mishar haktaras to shar kehanim. We just wanted to differentiate between the haktarah that the Kohen Gadol did versus the Haktarah that ordinary Kohanim did. But it wasn't a real mitzvah smicha. Thus, the Mishnah is still correct when the Mishnah says that there was a chumrah that Tenufa had over smicha, that Tenufa was bechayim ubeshchutin, mashe'en came besmicha exhale. Hadron Allah shnei midah. So before we go weiter and we begin the next parak, which is a completely new topic, two ha'aris as it relates to the mitzvah of smicha. The first is a more lamdish ha'ara. The second one is a lighter ha'ara. So one of the halachas that we saw on Daf Tzad Gimel was the Mishnah said, Akol Saimchen. Everyone has an obligation to do so. You bring a carbon, you have a mitzvah smicha. And then the Mishnah gave 8 exceptions to the rule. Chutz micheres shoyte v'katan, v'suma v'oivet keichavim, v'ha'eved v'ha'shliach v'ha'ishas. One of the balei carbon mentioned in the Mishnah that is exempt from the mitzvah of smicha is an isha. There's a very important machlokes in Shas between the Tanoim whether a woman who's excluded from the mitzvah of smicha, does that mean she doesn't have a chiyuv to do smicha? But if she wants to do smicha, she can do smicha? Or does it mean even more than that? That a woman cannot do smicha. The Brisa says as follows: Rosh Hashanah daf lamed gimel lamed aleph. It's also in Chagiga daf tezayin. This is something that's mentioned many places in Shas. Dabrel b'nei Yisrael soimchin ve'ein b'nei Yisrael soimchos devi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says dafka b'nei Yisrael soimchin ve'ein b'nei Yisrael soimchos. That means if a woman wants to do smicha, she cannot do smicha. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon say noshim soimchos rishos. No, it's not true. That it's only that a woman doesn't have to do smicha that we learn from b'nei Yisrael soimchos. But if a woman wants to do smicha, it's something that she has a right to do. Now, at first glance, this machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda on the one side, Rabbi Yosef and Shimon on the other side, is a very specific, a very local machlokes regarding the halacha of smicha. There's exeris akasav that women are exempt from smicha. Rabbi Yehuda understood it means they're not allowed to do smicha. Rabbi Yosef and Shimon understood it just means they're not obligated to do smicha. But in terms of it having ramifications in other areas in halacha, muscho rishon, you would say, stating that the Gemara Mesechtes Rosh Hashanah daf lamed gimel lamed aleph says an unbelievable chiddush. We know that women are pater from mitzvah sasei shazman gerama. What happens if a woman wants to be Mekayim, a mitzvah sasei shazman gerama? She wants to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. She wants to take daled minan on Sukkot. She wants to be Mekayim, one of the mitzvah sasei shazman gerama. Is it okay or is it not okay? Now, of course, la halacha, it's okay. Not just that. we paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, the Ashkenazim do, that a woman even makes a bracha if she does a mitzvah esei shazman gerama. But we're discussing this on the Tanoim level, not on the halacha level. On the Tanoim level, is it okay for a woman to be mekayim a mitzvah esei shazman gerama? Zokti Gemara, it's totally in this machlokes. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that holds that a woman is not allowed to do smicha. Being that she's exempt from smicha, it's usher for her to do smicha. It would be usher for a woman to be mekayim a mitzvah asay shazman gerama. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, that hold that a woman is just exempt from mitzvah smicha. But if she wants to do smicha, she can. Nashim soimchais rishos, says the Gemara, if a woman would want to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, if she'd want to be mekayim a mitzvah asay shazman gerama, it would be okay. In other words, this machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda on the one hand, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon on the other hand, is not a local, regional machlokes. This is a global machlokes. This is a machlokes that's nogeya, literally kol ha'torah kula. According to Rabbi Yehuda, shteit ha'yesoid, that if a woman is pater from a mitzvah, she's not allowed to do the mitzvah. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, a woman is pater from a mitzvah just means that she's exempt from doing the mitzvah. But certainly, if she wants to, tava alei and bracha, she can even make a mitzvah. She can make a bracha according to Rabbeinu Tam. Regardless, a very, very important machlokes. The shaila is, but what's pshan in Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda holds that just because a woman is pater from smicha, she can't do smicha. Just because a woman is pater from blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah, that means she can't blow Rosh Hashanah. So Rashi in Nesechtes Rosh Hashanah, Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, says an unbelievable chiddush. Zoktei L'Ger Rashi, the Pturais L'Gamri. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a woman who's pater from blowing shofar is pater L'Gamri. The mitzvahs esesh as man geramahu. So v'chitaki, if she blows shofar, Ikka Bal Taisef. She's going to be over Bal Taisef. So it says Rashi, you want to know the beer in Shitas Rabbi Yehuda? Bal Taisef. We know the halach is you're not allowed to add a fifth parasha to tefillin. You can't add another min to the dalin minim of your lulav. You can't be moisef in a mitzvah. A woman who's going to do a mitzvah that she's pater from, says Rashi, Ikka Bal Taisef. Rashi says it again in Masechtas Erev and Daf Tzadik Vav twice. Al Kopanim Shitas Rashi Kiyadua is that Pshat Rabbi Yehuda who holds that women who are pater from mitzvahs esesh as man gerama cannot do the mitzvahs esesh as man gerama. It's based on the Issa Bal Taisef. The Marsha in Rosh Hashanah Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph asks the obvious question. The Marsha says, Bal Taisef, what does that have to do with Bal Taisef? Bal Taisef always means you're being moisef in the mitzvah. So you have a mitzvah to put on tefillin. The mitzvah is 4 parashiyos. You added a 5th parashiyah. You have a mitzvah to take daled minim. You added a 5th min. I have a chiyuv to do a mitzvah, and I was moisef in the mitzvah that I'm mechuyev to do. That's the classic Bal Taisef. But for Eitam Marsha, who ever heard of a Bal Taisef where I don't have an obligation to do this mitzvah? I'm not being mechadesh a mitzvah. This mitzvah exists. This mitzvah is chai v'kayim. It just so happens I personally am exempt from doing this mitzvah. So because I did a mitzvah that I'm pater from, that's Bal Taisef. Bal Taisef means when I'm creating a mitzvah. I'm being moisef in a mitzvah. But to do something that I'm pater from, certainly in the world of lumdis, just based on the simple understanding of how Bal Taisef works, would seem to be a big chiddush. But either way, that is Rashi Shita. Stating that, Tosfos in Masechtas Eruvin, Daf Tzadik Vav Amud Aleph argues. Tosfos brings Rashi. Tosfos says he doesn't think that's the pshat, but rather Tosfos said pshat something else. And behektem a very big chiddush, and that is that when Rabbi Yehuda said that women who are pater from mitzvahs asay shazman gerama cannot do mitzvahs asay shazman gerama, Rabbi Yehuda didn't mean all mitzvahs asay shazman gerama. He was referring specifically to a mitzvah that involves a little bit of an isser. We are stating that despite the fact that tzad isser, there's a mitzvah to do the mitzvah. A woman who's pater, she can't do it. So, for example, says Tosfos, I'll find you 4 places in Shas where you find that Chazal talked about this concept of a woman who's pater, it should be us according to Rabbi Yehuda. You find it by smicha. That's our sugya. Nashim are exempt from smicha. Rabbi Yehuda holds a woman can't do smicha. Says Tosfos, that makes sense because if you can't do smicha, then you're not allowed to lean on an animal that's kachim. You're not allowed to do avodah b'kachim. It's me'ilah. You're not allowed to have anah from kachim. You're getting involved in really surim. So says Tosfos over there. Rabbi Yehuda said, being that there's a isser if you don't have the mitzvah, a woman who doesn't have the mitzvah cannot do it. Another place you find this by shofar. This Gemara that we just learned, Rosh Hashanah Daf Lamed Gimel. Tkiyah shofar involves a malacha. You're not allowed to play an instrument on Yontif. Tkiyah shofar involves a malach. That's the Taz's kasha. Why weren't the Chachamim Geyser, Shemi Yisak and Klei Shir, that you should never be allowed to blow shofar? You shouldn't blow shofar on Shabbos, Sheva Yamirenu. You should never blow shofar. Because that's the Taz's chiddush, that we never make a takana and exera that's giving mavat mitzvah. But the point is, it's a tzad issa when it comes to Tkiyah shofar. So if you have a mitzvah, you have a mitzvah. But a woman who doesn't have the mitzvah, she can't blow shofar. Another place Taisa says where you find this is by tefillin. The Gemara talks about Michal Bas Kushi, that was Michal Bas Shol, Hoysam Menachos tefillin. So you find a discussion in the Gemara whether a woman is allowed to put on tefillin or not. There too, because tefillin sarich guf naki ka'alisha bal knafayim, and being that women back in the day were considered to not have guf naki, damnida, etc. So as a result, a woman, if she doesn't have the mitzvah of tefillin, wouldn't be allowed to put on. And finally, Tais says the fourth place he finds is by a lila regel. The Gemara discusses over there Masechtas Eruvin, and Tais says for a woman to be lila regel, she's potter from being lila regel. Yeira kol zechurcha. A woman is potter from being lila regel. It could be there's a gedder of chulin lazara. Ayin sham b'Taisus. But regardless, Taisus argues with Rashi. Taisus has nothing inherently wrong with doing a mitzvah that you're potter from doing. This has nothing to do with Bal Taisus, presumably for the Marsha's reason, because Bal Taisus is when you're being mechadesh a mitzvah or you're being safe in a mitzvah. Over here, I'm just doing something that he's chayiv to do that I'm personally not chayiv to do. That's not Bal Taisa. Why then would there be a problem? What is the beer in Shitas Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yehuda's halacha only relates to cases where there's a tzad iser, where there's a tzad iser, if you're obligated to do it. So you do it at the expense of the Isser. But when you're potter from doing it, I have no right to do it because it comes with an invoice that I have no way of paying. I'm not allowed to go ahead and be Mekayim, a mitzvah that I'm not obligated to be Mekayim if it means being Mishtamish Bekachim, if it means bringing Chulun Lazara, if it means wearing tefillin without a guf naki, or if it means blowing shofar, playing with an instrument on Yontif, which is something that ordinarily you'd not be allowed to do. Bottom line, a very important nafkamina law. According to Rashi, it relates to all mitzvahs. According to Taisus, it only relates to specific mitzvahs. Stating that, there's a very important ran in the beginning of the second parak in Masechtas Sukkah. The context over there is a well-known Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Hayoshin tachas hamita b'sukkah layatzi yidei chayvasi." If somebody sleeps in the sukkah, but he sleeps underneath the bed in the sukkah, so the halach is lo yatza yidei chayvasi. I'm skipping. Amar Reb Shimon Maisa b'Tevi avdei Rabbi Gamliel. There was a story with Tevi, who was the eved of Rabbi Gamliel. Shayoshin tachas hamita. He was sleeping underneath the bed in a sukkah. V'amar lehen Rabbi Gamliel l'skenim. Rabbi Gamliel told the skenim, "Reisim Tavi avdi shu Talmud Chacham." You see, my Eved, he's a big Talmud Chacham. The Yodeya Sha'avodim Pturim min HaSukkah. Tosfos and the Ran all quote Yerushalmi that Yerushalmi over there discusses that the reason Tevi had to sleep underneath the bed was being that Tevi was an Eved Kanani, and an Eved Kanani is hookish liisha in terms of what mitzvahs he is and isn't obligated in. Sukkah is a mitzvah esish as mangaram and nashim apater. That means Tevi was pater as well, so he wasn't allowed to sleep in the sukkah. The reason he was sleep pashi, you learn he was making room, but Yerushalmi says a different shot. Yerushalmi says it was asr for him to sleep in the sukkah, and the reason it was asr is because there was a mitzvah esish as mangaram, and he had no right to do a mitzvah esish as mangaram. Pashi is going to Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that Noshim are not allowed to do smicha. A woman's not allowed to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Because being that she's potter, it's aser. She can't do it, get schar, and even make of it tzivanu, like Rabbeinu Tam says. No. It's aser to do. It's a pasha. Yerushalmi's going, but she does Rabbi Yehuda. Aber fragt the Ran, what's the tzad issue? Why should it be a problem? And says, don't tell me Rabbi Yehuda shita, because the Ran understood Rabbi Yehuda the way Tosfos and Erev and Daf Tzadik Vav did. That the only time there's ever a problem for a woman to do a mitzvah sasish as mangarama is if there's a tzad iser. But fragt the Ran, b'shleim al regel, chulun lazara, tefillin, guf naki. Blowing shofar, it's a clay shear. Smicha, you're being mishtamish bekachim. But what's the tzadis if you're sleeping in a sukkah? What are you doing? You're doing something wrong? See, you be mekayim mitzvah, you're not being mekayim mitzvah, whatever. But what's the tzadis? Why should it be a problem? Now, wait, Rashi, we understand. It's Bal Toisa. But the Ran didn't understand like Rashi. The Rashi had kalent azavi tesvis. So if you understood, pshat, Rabbi Yehuda like Toisa and Erev and that tzadik vav. So the Ran asks the obvious question. And the Ran says two terutzim. The first teretz, the Ran says that maybe the issue over there wasn't the actual sleeping in a sukkah, it was more the bracha. Rabbi Gamliel thought that Tavi was going to make a bracha, it was a bracha issue. Okay. Shlomo says the Ran that it's true. The real reason that a woman can't do a mitzvah essay as man grom is because of the tzad iser. But being that some mitzvahs essay involve an iser and other mitzvahs don't involve an iser, the Chachamim made an unequivocal gzeira. They said a woman cannot be mekayim a mitzvah essay as man grom. In other words, it's true. The reason why a woman shouldn't be able to be mekayim a mitzvah essay as man grom is like Tosfos says in Erevin, and that only relates to specific mitzvahs essay. But once the Chachamim said that a woman can't do certain mitzvahs essay, they made universal takana and gzeira and isser and said a woman can never be mekayim mitzvah essay. It doesn't matter if there is a tzad isser or if there's not a tzad isser. And being that at the end of the day it's mitzvah essay shazman garama, says the Ran, I have no choice but to be madchik that's pshat in that Yerushalmi in the beginning of the second parak of Masechta Sukkah. But I'm going to tell you a beautiful ara that I saw. We spoke this out when we learned Masechta Sukkah, but that was a very long time ago. In the Sefer Zichron Shmuel from Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, and that is Behektim, a very big chiddush from the Einig Yontif. The Einig Yontif in Orach Chaim Tshuva Mem Test asks a bomb kasha, Kedarka Bakodesh. He says that we know if a person's sitting in a sukkah and it starts raining. So what's the halacha? So Ramah says if you remain in the sukkah, nikra hedyet. So some people leave the sukkah. The Chassidim used to say, I'd rather be a hedyet and still sit in the sukkah. V'hadvarim atikin ve'in kam l'koyim l'harach. But the pashut pshat is, just the ikr halacha and shulchan aruch is that if you're sitting in a sukkah while it's raining, you're not mekayim a mitzvah, you're supposed to leave. You're nikra hedyet. Freik the Einig Yontif, the Gemara says in Masechta Sukkah Daf Tesam and Aleph that atzei sukkah are aser b'hana. Chag HaSukkos, we compare the sukkah to the Karban Chagiga. And just like the Karban Chagiga was a carbon, it was kachim, mi'ila, it's asabana, so too the Atzei Sukkah is asabana. What do you mean it's asabana? You're allowed to sit in a sukkah, you haven't got off from the sukkah. The teretz is b'makam mitzvah, of course you're allowed to be nana from it. But Atzei Sukkah, shaloi b'makam mitzvah, is asabana. Freik the Einig Yontif, and he really blibes with a kasha, and he says, I want to say a tremendous chiddush la'alacha, that if somebody's sitting in a sukkah, and it starts raining, not only are you nikra hedyet if you stay in the sukkah, you have to run for your life. You have to get out. Because if you're going to stay in the sukkah, it's going to come out you're being nene from the sukkah. And being that it's shaloi b'makam mitzvah, because you're not being mekayim the mitzvah, you're a mitzvah. So you're being nene from the sukkah, shaloi b'makam mitzvah. So if you're being nene from the sukkah, shaloi b'makam mitzvah, says the Einig Yontif, he asks that as a kasha, v'advarim atikin, Einig Yontif, Orach Chaim, Simen Mem Test. That's the Einig Yontif Zahara. Zok Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, I have a raya from this Ran, not like the Einig Yontif. Because the Ran asked the kasha, he says the Yerushalmi it's mavur that the reason Tavi, Abdi Shobek Gamliel slept underneath the bed was because he understood he was an Evet Knani. He's like an Isha. He's parted from Sukkah, which according to Rabbi Yehuda means it's Aser. Frank the Ran, the only time a woman is not allowed to be Mekayim and Mitzvah Saseh Man Grom is when there's a Tzad Isser. He said, what's the Tzad Isser? I don't know what the Tzad Isser is. And the Ran had to be Mechadish, V'ais from this Yerushalmi, that even though the reason, the underlying svara for Rabbi Yehuda Shita is because of a tzad iser, but at the end of the day, the Chachamim related it to all mitzvahs aseh, even when there's no tzad iser. Frank Reb Shmuel, why? L'chayr it's pasha what the tzad iser is. The Einig Yontif's kasha. The tzad iser is if Tavi is potter from mitzvah sukkah, that he's not allowed to sit in a sukkah. Because by him sitting in a sukkah, he's being nene from the atzei sukkah, shaloi b'makam mitzvah. Elamai says, Reb Shmuel, you see from here, not like the Yontif's kasha, it's just a beautiful ara. Either way, that's the first ara. The second ara is, so the Gemara said that there's an halacha of tekef l'smicha shchita. So the smicha and the shchita had to be done, one right after the other. That's this halacha of tekef l'smicha shchita. There's a Gemara Masechtas Brachos, Daf Membeis Amid Aleph. The Gemara over there says as follows: Amar Rab Chia bar Rashi, Amar Rav Shalosh Tkifosein. There are three things that have to be done. Tekef, miyad. Tekef l'smicha shchita. Tekef l'geula tefillah. There's a mitzvah to be saimech geula l'tefillah. Tekef l'netilas yadayim bracha. And immediately after a person washes netilas yadayim, it's talking about mayim achroinim. Bracha, you're supposed to bench. Amar Abaya said, Af anu noimar. I have another one to add. Tekef l'talmidei chachamim bracha. Says Rashi, Hamakrivay Elov Uma'arche Bebesai. If somebody has a Talmud Chacham in his house, immediately after he has his Talmud Chacham in his house, Sekum Bracha, it comes a Shefa, Shenemar Tu Mekairis. Vayivarcheni Hashem Beglolich. Lavan told Yaakov that I got Bracha because of you. Iba Yisem Mehacha, Shenemar Vayivarch Hashem is based on Mitzri Beglal Yosef. Then when Yosef moved into Paitifar's house, so Bracha came to the base Mitzri. So you see from these two psukim that a Talmud Chacham brings bracha. So Abaye said, I want to add to Rav's list. Rav said, Shalish Tkifosein, Tekef l'smicha shchita, Tekef l'geula tefillah, Tekef l'netilas yadayim bracha. I have a fourth Tekef. Tekef l'talmidei chachamim bracha. The Gemara in brachas, Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis, says, Tekef l'netilas yadayim suda. That when a person washes, not mayim machroinim, mayim rishonim, immediately not supposed to be mafsek. Immediately afterwards, you're supposed to eat the suda. Freik Taisus Akasha, the Gemara on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara we just mentioned says Sholish Tkifos Sein. Now it's true one of them involves a Suda, but it's Takev and Netilas Yadayim Bracha, which means right after Mayim Achroinim you're supposed to bench. L'chur, there's a fourth one. This Gemara in Beis Amud Beis Takev and Netilas Yadayim Suda says Tosfos. True, it is a fourth one. At the same time, Rav didn't mention it because Takev and Netilas Yadayim Suda is a Mefurish Mishnah, and Rav didn't want to mention something that's Mefurish in a Mishnah. So he was mentioning three Tkifos that are not explicit anywhere in a Mishnah, but in a Chinami, there's really a fourth. As it relates to that fourth one, as it relates to that fourth one, the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchas B'tzias Apas in Siman Kuf Samach Vav brings the halacha. Yesh oimrim she'ein tzarich lizar milahafsik beinatila lahamoitzi. Some hold that you don't have to be careful about being mafsik between washing your hands and saying hamoitzi. V'yesh oimrim she'tzarich lizahir, that you do have to be careful. V'toiv lizahir. And the right thing to do is to be nizar. Says the Rama, v'imsha kidei hiloch chaf beis amma mikri hefsik. Says you want to know what the sheer hefsik is? So you want to be mahadar. You want to make sure that it's going to be takeoff linatilas yadayim bracha, like the v'yesh oimer in the mechaber, of course, based on this gemara bracha staf nun beis amud beis. So what's the sheer? What does it mean? You wash your hands, then that second you should make the bracha? No, it's sheer chaf beis amos. The amount of time that it would take to walk 22 amos, which is approximately 44 feet. That's what the sheer is. That would be the amount of time that you're supposed to weigh in between. What's the makar to it? So the Ramah says it's a Tosfos in Masechta Soita Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, and it's actually a very interesting makar. Tosfos over there says that the Gemara says in Zvachal Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. We mentioned the Gemara earlier that even though the Mishnah says takef the smicha shchita, but at the same time there was one exception to the rule. The Mitzayra, when he brought his carbon asham and he had to do smicha on the asham Mitzayra, they couldn't do it right away. Why? Because he had to be standing in Shar Niknar and the shchita had to be in Kachi Kadashim. Asham is had to be in Safin because it's Kachi Kadashim. So it took time until it wasn't. Says Tosfos, how much distance was there between Shar Niknar and Safin? Tosfos does the math. It comes out it was 22 amos. If it's 22 amos, says Tosfos, I'm not sure what the sheer takeoff is, but I know what it isn't. Meaning, if you walk 22 amos, that's already not takeoff. It's based on that Tosfos regarding a kachim diga halacha, takeoff l'smicha shchita, that the Ramah said, you want to know how long you can nunu between Yonatilas Yadayim and baking hamoitzi, it's a shir chav beis amos. Now, the Ramah didn't really have a makar that any distance within 22 amos is taken. All the Ramah knows is that more than 22 amos is not taken. But okay, Al Kapanim, there's a makar to Ashir, we have a number. The number is Chav Beis Amos, and that's the source, that's the makar to this Ramah. But I just think, you see one beautiful thing from this Gemara over here, and Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. So Rav said a halacha sholish tkifosem. Take it for smicha shchita, take it for gula tefillah, take it for tefillah bracha. Tosfos adds to the list based on the Gemara and Beis Amud Beis, take it for tefillah zayim suda. Abaye said, af anu noimar, take it for talmidei chachamim bracha. That after a person has a talmid chacham in his house, again, hamakriva elov, uma'archoy bebeisei, it comes out immediately is going to be bracha. But now that we said that we know what the sheer takeoff is, the sheer takeoff is chav beis amos. That means this Gemara, this skula, that the Gemara says that if a person has a talmid chacham in his house, he's Hana Talmud Chacham, Ma'archoy Bebeisai, that's Lashon Rashi, Makriva Yelav, that he's Zoichet to Bracha, it's not 30 days credit. This is not 30, 60, 90. But this is Tekef, Shir Chav Beis Amos. There's an immediate bracha that the person is Zoichet to. It's an immediate shefa, it's immediate bracha. Just tell you one ha'ara. The Lashon HaGemara is, Tekef the Talmidei Chachamim bracha. It's Talmud Chacham. Emphasis on Talmud Chacham. Now, what's the makar? The Gemara brought two makaris. Number one, Vayevarcheni Hashem biglalech. Number two, Vayevarch Hashem is based on Mitzvah Biglal Yosef. Vayevarcheni Hashem biglalech is Lavan talking. That when Yaakov came to Lavan, he got bracha. The second pasuk is referring to Yosef. Now, Yaakov was a Talmud Chacham. Yaakov was an Ishtam Yosef Ahalim. Yosef was also a Talmud Chacham. The Gemara Yuma, Yosef is Mechayev the Yefei Torah. They're going to ask him, the Yefei Torah, why didn't you learn Torah? Were you better looking than Yosef? Right, that's the thing where you had more Nisyonis than Yosef. Nobody. Yosef HaTzadik is the Avi voice of Nisayin and being Oimid ben Nisayin. But you see from the Gemara that Yosef HaTzadik learned Torah, right? Ben Zekunim, Yaakov Avinu taught him all his Torah. But the bottom line is Yaakov and Yosef were Talmidei Chachamim, and the Gemara is learning from there that you see from there take of the Talmud Chacham bracha. But it's interesting that the Gemara thought that the punchline of why Yaakov brought bracha to Beis Lavan is because he was a Talmud Chacham. The punchline of why Yosef brought bracha to the Beis Mitzri was because he was a Talmud Chacham. Incidentally, I saw in the Chidah, in the Sefer Pesach Einayim, he brings that the pasuk says, "Vayihi me'oz hifkid oisei beveisoi, v'al kol asher yeshloi vayivarech Hashem es Beis HaMitzri beglal Yosef." Vayihi me'oz. It was takef. Chidah. It was takef. Vayihi me'oz. As soon as this Mitzri, Potiphar, brought Yosef into his house, immediately vayivarech Hashem es Beis Mitzri. But how did the Gemara know that it was out the Talmud Chacham Shebohem? It was the Talmud Chacham Yaakov. It was the Talmud Chacham Yosef. Maybe it was the Merkava Yaakov. It was the Mus Yukna is Tachas Kisei Yaakov. Maybe it was Yosef HaTzadik. How do we know that it was the Talmud Chacham? That was the Ar. But I'll tell you one beautiful Maramakim. The Rabbeinu Bechaya on that pasuk, Vayivarech Hashem es Beis HaMitzri beglal Yosef. Listen to Rabbeinu Bechaya's lashon. Him shilei hakasav la'aron abris. This is unbelievable. The Torah equated Yosef HaTzadik to the Aron. Shekasav by Shmuel Beis. Vayeshev Aron Hashem Beis Oved Edom Hagiti of Shmuel Beis fame. So the Aron was in the house of Oved Edom Hagiti shloisha chadashim for 3 months. Vayevarech Hashem es Oved Edom ves kol Beisai. Chazal say they were gave birth to children, Shishu B'Keres. They had unbelievable bracha. Why? Because he had the Aron in his house. Says Rabbeinu Bachya, you want to know why when Yosef came to the house of Potiphar, he brought bracha? Him Shiloi HaKasav Lo Aron Abris. Just like you find in Shmuel Beis, that Oyved Edom Hagiti had bracha because he had the Aron in his, he had the Aron Abris with the Luchas and the Kruvim. He had the Aron in his house. What did the Aron bring? It brought bracha. In the same exact vein, Yosef HaTzadik brought bracha as well. L'chura, what was the bracha of the Aron? It was the Torah. It was the Aron HaEdos. It was the Luchais. It was the Torah that the Aron had in it. So if that's the Him Shiloi HaKasav, it wasn't just Yosef the Tzaddik. It was Yosef the Talmud Chacham. It was the Torah. Someone who learns Torah, it's Kohen Gadol HaNichnas Lefnai V'Lefnim. What's Lefnai V'Lefnim? That's the Aron HaBris, is Lefnai V'Lefnim. The Aron was what carried in it. It was the embodiment of Torah Shebiksav. The Talmud Chacham is the Torah Shebapel. What the Aron is, the Torah Shebiksav is what to say the Torah. What the Luchais is, the Torah Shebiksav. But either way, him Shiloi Hakasav LaAron Abris, just like the Aron brought bracha to the bias of Oyved Edom Magiti, it was in the same exact vein that Yosef HaTzadik and Yaakov, they brought bracha. Regardless, that's this Gemara that Abaye said, I'm going to add another takev the Talmidei Chachamim bracha. Either way, on that note, Zokt the Mishnah Vayta. If we have time, maybe we'll speak out some more rich. Shtei halechem, niloishois, achas, v'nefois, achas. So we return to the sugis of Shtei halechem that were brought together with the Kifsei Atzeres on Shavuos, and the halachis of the lechem ha-panim. So the Shtei halechem, which were 2 breads, were kneaded one at a time. V'nefais achas. They had to be baked one at a time. Lechem ha-panim, delicious achas. They were kneaded one at a time. But v'nefais shtayim. They were baked 2 at a time. Ubetfus haya oisan. And there was a tfus, like a form that the dough was put into, so that the lechem hapanim would get the special form that it was supposed to have. A lot more about that in the Gemara. Kishahu roidon, when the kohen would remove the breads from the oven where the lechem hapanim were baking, noisan litfos, he would put it into another defos, another form, so it shouldn't go bad. Says the Gemara, Mino hani mili. How do you know that the shtei halechem were niloishois achas, v'nefois achas, whereas the lechem haponim were niloishois achas, but v'nefois shtayim. Tan Rabbanon shnei esronim yeh hachala ha'achas. It's referring to the lechem haponim. Melami, we learn from here shen niloishois achas. So shnei esronim yeh hachala ha'achas teaches me that the lisha was done one at a time. How do you know the Shtei Halechem was the same way? Yiyah includes Shtei Halechem to this halach, meaning the pasuk is talking about the lechem hapanim. Yiyah includes even the Shtei Halechem. How do you know the lechem hapanim were baked 2 at a time? Talmud loymar v'samta oisam. Oysam's a lashon rabbin. Yochel, I would have thought Av Shtei Halechem came. The Shtei Halechem were also baked 2 at a time. Talmud loymar oisam. only then, only the lechem aponim were two at a time. The shtei lechem were one at a time. How could you use oisam to teach me two things? You're telling me oisam teaches me that the lechem aponim were two, and it also teaches me that the shtei lechem were one. Says the Gemara, very simple, because if all the Torah wanted to tell me was that the lechem aponim were baked two at a time, it wouldn't have said v'samta oisam. Rather, it would have said v'samtam. My v'samta oisam shamet mina tarti. We learn from there, number one, that the lechem aponim were two at a time. Number one, two, that the shtei lechem were one at a time. Tanu rabbanon v'samta oisam b'tfus. So the lechem aponim were put in this tfus that was in the oven. Shloisha tfusim him, says the Gemara. There were three of these forms. Nois l'tfus v'adayin hibatzik. When it was in the form of dough, it was put in a tfus. U'kamin tfus hayla batana. There was another tfus that was inside the oven. U'kishehu roida. When the kohen would do Ridias Hapas, he would remove it from the oven, nois na betfus, he would put it into a third tfus, kadesh like the skalka, so that it shouldn't go bad. So there were three independent kalim that the lechem aponim were in to give the molds, right? To give the lechem the form that it was supposed to have. Thank you. Says the Gemara, ulahadru l'tfus kama. Why couldn't the first mold and the third mold be the same mold, right? Why did you need two separate ones? Why couldn't, when you're taking it, meaning one was in the oven, okay, so that one remained in the oven, but it was going to be in the form that was outside the oven twice. Once in the form of dough, once after it was already. So why couldn't it be the same one? The Gemara says, "Keep the apple in nafka," because once you bake it expands in size. Size is going to be too big. It's going to be too big to be able to put it back into the original form. So one was a little bit smaller. It was the same shape, but one was a little bit smaller than the other one. Itmar lechem aponim ketzad oisin oisam. What was the shape of the lechem haponim? So if you're picturing chalos, that's the wrong picture. If you're picturing loaves of bread, that's also the wrong picture. What was it? It's a machlekes. Rab Chanina says kemin teva prutza. Rabbi Yochanan says, Kimin Sfida Reikadas. Teva Prutza, so Rashi gives us pictures, if you have an art scroll or an Oiz Vahadar, so there's an updated picture. Teva Prutza is a box that doesn't have a cover, and it's missing two of its walls. So it's parutz meruba ala oimid, but basically it's this dilapidated box. So essentially what you're left with is a flat bottom and two walls as opposed to four walls. Additionally, you don't have the top. Rabbi Yochanan's picture is a little bit trickier. It was kamin sfida reikadas. Literally, it was like a speedboat. That's what it means. So number one, it wasn't flat on the bottom, but rather the bottom was pointy. Now, it had to have a little bit of a base on the bottom. Rashi says the base was kamin etzba. How big is an etzba? Additionally, the two sides, the two ends, it wasn't flat, but like a boat that comes to a point at the end. So it's like a little pinch. If you have the picture on the two sides, the bread itself was rounded. So again, a few differences. Number one, it wasn't flat on the bottom. It didn't have a flat bottom. The flat part of it was all it was an etzba. Number two, it was round as opposed to square. So the two sides, the width was going to be semicircles on each side, and the two edges on the length were pinched. They came to a little bit of a point. And the Gemara is going to ask kashas back and forth now on the two respective pshatim. Was the lechem aponim like a teva prutza, or was the lechem aponim like a smida rekada? Says the Gemara, I understand where they put the beziche levayin. There were two scoops of levaina that were on the lechem aponim. Now, the scoops were actually on the breads. So if you picture the teva prutza, which is incidentally the halacha, so the halacha is that the lechem aponim was shaped like a teva prutza. So the picture you usually have is on the top of the two upper breads, each had one of the beziche levaina respectively. That's what it looked like, right? So bishloima, according to the mandama that holds that it was flat, it was a flat bread. So I understand where you're able to put the teva prutza. El mandama kimin sfina reikad, that's where it was round. Right? It sloped down. There was no flat area inside the bread to be able to put the beziche levaina. So the Gemara says you have to say makam avlahu, that they would make a little place tucked away into one of the walls of the bread. It was like a little shelf, so to speak, and that's where they would put the beziche levaina. Meaning the bread itself didn't have the receptacle that was wide enough to be able to hold the beziche levaina in it. What they would do is they would put it inside one of the interior walls of the breads. That's where they would put it. There were poles, as we're going to see on Daf Tzadik Vav, that separated the breads. So there were 12 lechem aponim, yid bais chalas, and they were piled up on top of the shulchan, but they didn't put put bread on top of bread on top of bread. There were 3 golden rods, kanim, that separated each layer of breads. So the Gemara says, according to Mandama says that it was a teva prutza, it makes sense how they were able to put the 3 rods, right? If you look at that picture right there. So you have the 3 rods, one on each end, one in the middle. You put the next bread on top of that. But being that it's a nice, square, wide bread, it could support the kanim, it could support the rods. Where did they put the rods? Bishlam, the one in the middle you're able to put, but the 2 on the side, it comes to a little point at the end. So you're going to put it on the point. It's not big enough to be able to support it. So the Gemara says, they would add a little bit of dough that was thick enough and strong enough to be able to hold the pole. So you're right, the natural state of the bread, based on Rabbi Yochanan's picture, didn't have the ability to support the 2 kanim that are at the 2 ends. But if they added a little piece, now you're able to do it. The shulchan was a table. And again, the Mishnah Daf Tzadik Vav is going to go into very great technical detail. We're going to see everything as it relates to the shulchan. But if you picture the shulchan, so you have a table, that's the actual shulchan. The breads are piled on top, and then there were 4 beams that stood on the 2 sides that supported the breads. So the Gemara says, if according to Mandam it says it was teva prutza, I understand how the beams on the sides, those 4 long, tall beams, supported the breads. Because what they did is they would tuck the breads firmly, snugly in between the boards like this. It held it together. Elo Mandam means sfina rekadas, but according to Mandam it says it was a sfira rekadas. Hechavi samchilahu. It wasn't square, they were rounded. So if they were rounded, how exactly are these square boards going to support these rounded chalas? So the Gemara says, you have no choice but to say, the agolu mi'agol. They would round the boards also. That's how it was able to work. Now we flip it. That says that it was shaped like this ship that travels really fast. I knew the bein and sniffin. That's why you needed the sniffin in the first place. What even need it for? If it's a nice square, just pile one. You can't pile 6 breads on top of each other. What's the big deal? If it was in a shape it's hard to support, I understand it. But if it's strong, what's the big deal? So the Gemara says, Agav yukra de lechem plach. They were afraid that the breads were heavy, and we're afraid that the breads are going to break, and nishtabra halechem, you're getting involved in real difficult sugis in Masechtas Menachos. Much better to avoid that. That says it was a sfinarei kedes. I understand where they put the snifin. If you hold it was a sfinarei kedes, that means on the bottom, the width was merely an etzba. So the bottom breads, the ones that are literally on the shulchan, how much of the shulchan did they actually take up? It just took up 2 etzbas. 6 on one side, 6 on the other side, but it's, right, the piles, and on the bottom one, it's only an etzba. So there's room on the actual shulchan, underneath where the bread slope, to be able to put these snifin. So these beams were physically on top of the shulchan. There's room for it. But according to Mandam says there was a teva prutza. Because again, as we'll see on Daf Tzadik Vav, the length and the width of the breads mirrored literally to the etzba, to the tefach, what the length and the width of the shulchan was. So there was no room to put the snifin on the shulchan. So where did they put the snifin? So the Gemara says, they put it on the ground. It was on the ground. It didn't have to be physically on the shulchan. It was on the side of the shulchan, but it wasn't physically on the shulchan. So the Gemara asks it as a kasha. The Gemara says, yep. In the Amr Abba Bar Mamel, the Divrei Omer K'min Sfinarei Kadas, snifin al gabi shulchan munachin. If you hold it was a snifin, it was a sfinarei kedes, so you were able to put the snifin on the actual shulchan. The Divrei Omer Teva Prutza, according to Mandam says it was a Teva Prutza, sniffing al gabi karka munachin, you have no choice but to say that it was a gabi karka. One last kasha. Kaman Ozla, Hadam Rabbi Yehuda said, Alechem maimed es hasnifin vasnifin ma'amidan es alechem, that the way the snifin worked together with the breads was that the breads supported the snifin and the snifin supported the breads. The Gemara says, Kaman da Amar, sfinarei kadas. It's going to Mandam the whole sfinarei kadas, because being that it was rounded, so it wasn't just that the snifin were holding the breads were holding the snifin as well. But if you hold it was a teva prutza, so the snifin weren't really being supported the way it was just a regular board. You put it on the side of the shulchan. So we needed the boards to support the breads, but you didn't need the breads to support the boards. So machlokes Reb Chanina and Reb Yochanan, whether the lechem aponim would come in teva prutza or whether it was come in sfina rekadas, the Gemara said depending on what it was, technically it would play itself out. Nafkaminas, who was supporting who, misay mechas mi, and in terms of whether the boards were rounded and whether the boards were on the shulchan or they were on the side of the shulchan. But either way, the Gemara says, Meisvi, I'll ask you a kasha. Kemin kiveres hayala betanor. There was something shaped like a kiveres, like a basket that was inside the tanur. V'doima kemin tavla merubas, and it was like a tablet that was squared, and that's where they put the lechem aponim. Sounds like it was squared. Sounds like it was a teva prutza, not a sfina rekedes. So the Gemara says, Ema upia doima kimin tavla merubas. Maybe what it means is the top part, meaning everybody agrees the top part was squared. The question is what the bottom looked like. Was the bottom like the bottom of a box, or was the bottom sloped like the bottom of a ship? Tanya Kimandama Kimin Rekadis, a brisa that supports the mandama that says it was like the Sfina Rekadis. Tanya Abbas Snifin Shalzav Hayusham. There were these 4 snifin, Mifutsalin Mirosheim Kimin Dakronim. And they had these little things that were pointing out that looked like branches. The purpose of those things, again, more about this on Daf Tzadik Vav. But the reason these things were protruding was because the konim, these 3 poles that separated each layer of breads, had to fit into the konim somehow. So either way, it was based on that you needed these things inside the snifin. What was the purpose of it? They supported the breads, and here's the punchline: the breads which were daima to the sfina rekadas. So it's a tanya kavasi to Rabbi Yochanan, but stating that, if you take a look in Rashi and Chumash in Parshas Truma, and the Rambam when he talks about the Kli Hamikdash, they both paskin like the Manda Amar Kimin Teva Prutza. We're going to stop here. A lot more about this on Daf Tzadik Vav, and maybe we'll get back tomorrow to some more raid regarding smicha.